Harry Edwards, the Attorney General, will be fascinating. He made the front page of the paper today. We have someone very timely. And what's happening in the United States is very timely, as Dr. Santiago will go into. And I think it's important that all of us know what life is like in urban America, because it's not something that you could hide and make believe that if you don't see it, it's not there. It will influence every one of us. And that's why it's very important to be knowledgeable and know as much about it as you can. So thank you for coming. At the end of, at 3:30, we'll have refreshments downstairs. And right now, without normal things, I would like to introduce Dr. Ann Santiago from Seton Hall University.
I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak with you today. I know Ms. Cobb asked if I would briefly give you a little bit of background information about me. As you probably can tell, I certainly do not sound like I'm a New Jerseyan. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I got all of my academic training at the University of Wisconsin. I have a doctorate in urban social institutions. All right, that's fine. I have taught not only in Wisconsin, but I've also taught in Puerto Rico, and I recently came to New Jersey. I've been at Seton Hall for the past 2 years. I was invited to come and talk because I've basically done most of my research on urban concerns. I've done a national study on segregation, and I am currently continuing that work. I'm also involved in working on a project on homelessness and another study on tenant housing conditions. I just recently finished a study with someone else at Seton Hall looking at housing in East Orange.
Doctor said we can't hear you. Is there a microphone?
Unfortunately, the South Orange Library doesn't have a microphone.
I'll try as hard as I can, but I also know there's other users here, and I'm afraid that I don't want to be
No, we know. Don't worry. We told them to go downstairs. Today's our day.
All right. Well, if the people in the front wouldn't mind, I may come into the middle here, and then we'll be talking that way. Most of us in the United States live in urban areas. At this point in time, about 183 million people live in urban communities throughout the country. We've been an urban nation, or predominantly urban nation, for the last 60 years. The urban population has grown considerably, especially since the World War II. And what's interesting is that the urban communities have not only grown in terms of population size, they have grown in terms of geographical space, where the communities can extend for many, many miles. And we know we have a real good example of that here because we're part of the new, and officially we're considered a part of the larger New York metropolitan area. And it extends from Connecticut through Morris County in New Jersey. That's how large this particular urban area is. Now, what I decided to do in terms of my emphasis in our discussion today is basically look at some urban concerns that we have, and there are many of them, but my talk will focus on 4 concerns. One is in the area of municipal financing. The second would be in the area of urban development. We'll speak very briefly on housing, and then I'll end our discussion talking about environmental issues. All of them, I think, are very timely problems which, unfortunately, if we continue to ignore that they exist, we may not have much of an urban life left for us, and the quality of life will certainly deteriorate. Now, in terms of municipal financing, one of the major problems is that it's becoming more and more difficult to find money to pay for the services that we all expect for ourselves in a community. Part of this problem has resulted from, ironically, the extension of people into the suburbs. And it's especially hard on the older central cities because they have lost many times their ability to finance things through taxation of property owners, and secondarily through getting taxed to an industrial base that exists in the community. Both people and jobs have continued to move out of the older central cities into the suburban areas since about especially since the 1945, 1950s. Now, you say, well, how does this affect us? Most of you are living in the suburbs. Newer suburbs outside of places like South Orange have continued to grow, and the older suburbs are beginning to feel the same types of pressures in trying to finance the services that the residents expect to receive. Now, I would assume many of you can recall back in the mid-'70s when they were talking about New York City and the bankruptcy or the fiscal crisis. In this area, maybe in the last couple of years, we've forgotten about that problem because it seems like we're in an era when the economy is very, very strong. I know some of my students who are too young to realize what's going on can't visualize the fact that many cities, even today, are experiencing some very severe problems in trying to provide all the necessary services for their residents. And that is even true here. Even in as we say, in New Jersey, in a time of relative prosperity, there are many communities, I'm sure South Orange is one of them, that is continuing to struggle or is continually trying to struggle to make ends meet. And without the assistance of other funding sources, namely the state and the federal government, they are not able to pay for the services that they provide. Now, why does that occur? Partially because of the way that municipal services are funded to begin with. There was an expectation that the local residents would assume the entire burden for all of the expenses. And the major source of revenue for those services then would come from residents through property taxes. Now, as many of you are, I'm sure, are homeowners, you know that you can only get so much water out of a rock, so to speak. Is that it becomes more and more difficult to pay for those taxes just to meet the increases that come every year in terms of what the costs are. So local governments are not very well equipped to meet rising costs because they have a very limited funding source through your property tax. Now, what happens to make up for the shortfall when garbage collection rises dramatically, or when you need to build a new school in your community, or if you have to man or get more personnel in the police or fire department? That's when you start to see what we call the fiscal crisis that happens with communities, where in actuality they are spending much more than they can generate in terms of revenue. This problem has not disappeared. It may be a little bit cloudy or covered at this point in time in this area because it seems like we're prospering. But for many communities across the country, and I would even say in many communities here in this area, this problem has not disappeared, nor will it disappear. It will, because unless they do some kind of restructuring in terms of the way services are funded, or really make a strong effort to incorporate these kind of expenses within the state or federal government budgets, you're going to find, as many communities are finding, that they are oftentimes every year in debt, that they have to continue to reduce the services that they're providing, and that the taxpayers who live in those communities are having increases in their taxes.
I'd just like to ask you, because of the plight of the homeless and its public
government in terms of urban concerns and housing in particular has diminished in the last 8 years instead of increased. I don't think that they have not really changed very much their vision in terms of how this problem should be resolved. Most municipal problems, at least at the federal level, are perceived to be problems that the municipal government has to deal with, and that they should be looking for ways to deal with it within their own revenue sources, and not. There's much more reluctance in terms of having the federal government step in and provide that assistance. But then, on the other hand, we also contribute to that vision, because we don't want the federal government or the state government to tell us what to do if we live in a community. And so when you have funding from other sources, usually there's some stipulations that funding source will give you, and you may not be willing to accept those. If you look at the Star Ledger today, there's a good example with Livingston, who's decided to turn back the HUD grant, the Housing and Urban Development Grant for the housing for the elderly complex that they're building. I'm sure many of you saw that. It's on the first page. They turned back almost.
They don't want any interference.
Almost $500,000 that was going to be part of the expenses to construct that building. They said, well, we don't want HUD telling us really what we have to do with that housing. And so they turned it back.
Do you think that was wise of them?
Well, they had Was it wise? In the case of Livingston, they had budgeted for the project both with and without the grant. So they had made projections, and they had secured financing that included the $500,000 if they had $500,000 if they decided not to use the HUD grant. So in their case, they had made some kind of adjustment that would allow them to do so. There are some communities that wouldn't have that ability to do that. So it would depend on the circumstances.
Doctor, also remember that was, that's the word yesterday, that was not being built for the poor. This was only for senior citizens who could afford to go in there. Right. So it wasn't, they didn't actually need that money to that extent. Yeah.
Well,
So more than that, we also recognize, and I think to my point of view all of this, that 20 years ago, the communities were going crazy because they thought, let the federal government do it. Oh, it's wonderful to be able to turn to the federal government. And we did it right straight across the country. Dr. Barrett, let the federal government do it. And we have learned to our sorrow that the federal government has a way of spending money that doesn't exactly sit well with the local community. And a lot of communities have said, thank you very much, we don't want it anymore.
Well, that's what Livingston will be doing. That's in effect what Livingston would like to do. The only problem that I can foresee of saying no involvement at all from the state or the federal is that, again, then the burden falls on the local residents. And if you're a homeowner, and I'm sure many of you have been, I know I was not here currently, I'm not, but I have been where I was before. When you're getting $3,000 or $4,000 a year tax bills or more, and certainly once you retire, your ability to generate that income becomes very, very difficult. And so it's a kind of a balancing act, isn't it? But it's one that still has not been fully resolved. Again, kind of in summing up this particular portion of my talk, what has happened is even when we know that there has been a problem in financing municipal services, the federal government has tended to pull back in terms of the amount of money that it's providing for community aid. The state has been picking up much of the brunt of the shortfall.
there is a discrimination against housing for elderly people in the neighborhood. Young families who have mortgaged themselves to buy what they call a decent neighborhood.
Jimmy, can you stand up and repeat it? People can't hear you.
I was going to say that. There is discrimination against housing for older people. And young families who have mortgaged everything to move into what they call a good quote neighborhood resent the fact that they get older people are going to move in and their property values go down. But that's a whole business that they don't want. A lot of
Maybe we can, certainly there's some flexibility. I was going to talk about housing. Maybe we can spend some time now and talk about the housing. But you point out something that discriminatory practices.
There goes the neighborhood.
And this idea of if there's a group that is labeled as being undesirable, whether it be based on marital status, or the ethnic or racial origin, or now on age, or family composition, or sexual preference.
Or disease.
Now you're saying the disease, bringing in the whole issue, because they talked about it at the legislative level here about age. If you are labeled as being undesirable, that does certainly limit your ability to gain access to neighborhoods that you would like to live in. Yes, they are.
There's a dichotomy there, though, because older people don't like to live in neighborhoods where they're pulling over baby carriages and toys on the street, too.
Well,
I have a question about something that's been permeating for years with regard to municipalities. Throughout the state, you ride from one little municipality to the other. Each one has its own board. Each one does its own assessment. I have never seen a really broad plan trying to pull it into one larger structure in the state. So perhaps it wouldn't be so difficult to meet the expenses. Has there ever been anything?
yes, there are some communities in the country that have done it on a limited basis, and for specialized services. We have an example in this area, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. That represents more of a regional plan to try to deal with transportation in the area. The Tennessee Valley Authority, with the water and et cetera. So there are some very limited instances. Again, we go back to this whole issue of local rule and local autonomy. Most communities are reluctant to give up that power, even if it means that if they could do it some way and be as cost effective and be efficient, if they give up the power, they don't want to give up that.
Bureaucrats like their perks.
Well, in South Orange and Maplewood, we share
With
a
the school.
educational system.
Right. So you have some examples, but you certainly could do a lot more. And there are a number of services that would probably function better if they were done at a regional level, because it involves planning for the entire region instead of planning for just one community, and looking at the impact that some decisions might have on the whole picture instead of just on the local picture. So there are many things, but certainly the provision of basic services, water, electricity, the transportation, schooling. Many of those services would probably be better served if you could combine the forces and certainly combine the tax base in terms of providing those services. But municipal leaders are very, very reluctant, and moreover, residents of communities are also reluctant to give up. Okay, in terms of housing, certainly what's interesting in New Jersey and the idea of exclusionary zoning, and the fact that the courts have found that many municipalities in New Jersey use exclusionary zoning to keep the quote-unquote undesirables out. We found that something had to be done to rectify that situation. Most communities are under some, in effect, court orders to do some remedies in terms of providing, in particular, low income and moderate income families the ability to move into their local community. Well, what was brought up as earlier, this idea that if people of such and such background come into my neighborhood, the property values will decline. That's probably one of the strongest arguments you'll hear.
It's mostly that.
Yes, it is. It is.
How about the
mostly
fact that so much condominium and co-ops are going in and force people out of houses?
That's another. This is one of the issues we certainly can look at in terms of the development of condominiums and co-ops, which are in effect your comment is displacing residents. Maybe we can structure this in terms of several themes in terms of housing. We certainly are concerned about access to housing, and especially access to affordable housing. We need to be concerned about displacement of residents that might be brought on by things such as condominium or cooperative apartment conversion. I know I was involved in doing a study for the city of East Orange with a colleague at Seton Hall, and we found that there had been no systematic plan at the city level in terms of how to deal with condominium conversion and cooperative apartment conversions. As a result, in one area of the city already, more than 40% of the housing had been converted to condo or cooperative apartments. Now, if you have no planning in terms of what are the implications of that kind of development, that can cause even further pressures on local residents that are in those neighborhoods, and it also restricts their ability to move around the rest of the community as residents.
Isn't it a lack of lobbying? I mean, when a group of people fight for something, usually, they can sometimes prevent it from happening. Whereas if they just allow the planners, so-called planners, to take it, and affect, of course, the people who have an interest in it, the people who make a lot of money from making these houses into condos.
Well, communities are looking at, this ties in fairly nicely to the idea of fiscal crisis. Communities have looked at condominium and co-op development as one way to resolve some of their problems in terms of financing municipal services. Okay, because if they are converted into privately owned units, they pay taxes on those units, and they can generate a lot more tax revenue than they could have if one owner owned that building.
But if enough renters would protest, what I'm saying is if they had a strong leadership and said, we don't want this will evict us, we can't afford to buy what we're living in, but we could afford to rent it, what will happen?
They have very strong association in East Orange, no good rule. There's absolutely nothing. Landlord lobby is so strong that the tenants have nothing to say. Plus the fact there's no provision made for age. People can be in their 90s and have to get out if they want them to.
No, that's not true. No, not anymore. The one group that has been protected has been the elderly. In terms of legislation.
I am in the midst of such a situation.
Wait, can you stand up?
I'm in the midst of such a situation where I went in innocent and wide-eyed renting an apartment, and it came crashing down over my head as a condo. Now, the people that owned the building, managed the building, whatever, are now have lost interest. It's like a stepchild. They just want to sell all the apartments. They can't put me out. That's the one thing that they can't do over a certain age. I don't remember what it is. I'm definitely over it. I'm over any age. But they can't put me out. However, what they can do is sell my apartment, and I then have a one-to-one landlord, which could be very uncomfortable if he wanted my apartment. Now, the question came up, why don't the tenants groups organize? We tried. Do you know what it costs to hire such an attorney?
We're cruel now.
And do you know how much we did it? But we couldn't just keep paying and paying and paying. And the opposition had very strong lawyers. We didn't stand a chance.
They have more money.
Money and clout. And that was
Bobby is very strong in New Jersey.
everything.
State legislature has told first of all, now young married, but I cannot.
Well, at this point in time, though, still, if you're in my situation, say if you're young with a family, we would have like what's under law is 2 or 3. You have about 2 years to make that transition from the initial term of sale or a condo.
Well, the key word is comparable. The key word is they have to help you get comparable quarters.
That's right.
And that's the key word. That's the real secret in there.
Well, looking at housing and certainly in this whole issue, again, pulling this our discussion together, that has been viewed as a way of trying to make up for shortfall, going the conversion route. Not in all communities. It's very strong in the Northeast. It's much weaker in the Midwest, in the South, and as well as the West. This kind of conversion movement is the strongest here. Now, what does that do? Certainly, if those units are taken off the rental housing market, it decreases the amount of rental units available. At the same time, because there's a drop in those units, the cost of the rest of the units tends to increase, and then you have a problem of trying to find housing that's affordable.
So there is one slight other consideration that most of us forget. And that's construction costs. There are construction costs which are resuming, first of all, not only because of the lack of workmen. You know, we Americans have gotten a nice reputation for not wanting to soil our hands. And we've cut down on immigration, therefore we don't have construction workers. It's a vicious circle, if you will. In addition to that, we've put in our attempt to solve this problem, all kinds of high-tech machinery. Take a look across the street and see what's going on. You got 3 men working a crane and a whole business. You know what happened at Seton Hall just last week. I mean, everybody's screaming, and I don't happen to own that kind of property, but I can see the situation in its dimensions. We're all screaming they're greedy and their rents are going sky high and so on and so on and so on. But part of this problem is our initial problem of not enough hands to go around, just as we have in other areas of our society. A real critical problem based on the lack of people to do the work.
Well, the construction starts are very expensive.
And could you address what you see as being the need in our heavily populated urban area to meet the needs of the very low income people in cities like Newark and East Orange, where we hear much of the city's concern for upgrading the center city with corporate offices who are given tax breaks and all of this, and so it really doesn't help the tax base, where we hear much about gentrification of middle-class people wanting to come back in, or the city wanting to attract middle-class people. But in the midst of all of this stuff that sounds very good, what about the low-income folks who are racial, ethnic people for the most part, perhaps? What is the future that you envision, and what do the cities like Newark have to do to really meet their needs?
There's several things that they might be able to do that I know that they're not doing in this area, and it can tell you a little bit about the experience of Milwaukee, which they have successfully run for about 15 years an urban homesteading program. city-owned properties that they've acquired basically through delinquency and tax payments, instead of turning them over at auction to the highest bidder, what they've done is that they have enabled low-income, moderate-income, basically especially targeted for low-income families, the ability to try, they can buy them for $1. They can then renovate. They have 18 months to renovate the properties, and they have a further stipulation that they must reside in their property for 5 years. But they're turning over a number of those properties, and that's one way to start building those neighborhoods with residents that were from that neighborhood. My understanding of how it functions here is that they sell the properties at auction at the highest bidder. Now, what often happens is that some of the realtors or other investors are able to put in the highest bid, and they acquire the property. And so then they become the landlords, and there's no stipulation, as far as I understand, that you have to reside in those properties. That's a big difference. That's a very big difference. What they were trying to do in the case of Milwaukee, as I've pointed out, that's where I'm from, is that they were trying to enable residents of that community, of the local community, to be able to stay in their neighborhood, acquire housing. They can fix up the housing. They can work very good in terms of rehabilitation of those units. Furthermore, since many of those houses have been off the tax rolls for many years, they also generate taxes. And so they've been successful. We certainly do not have a large pool of single family or even duplexes available here to do that kind of thing. That's where Milwaukee's housing stock is basically in single family and duplexes. However, there has been some attempts, and I know Philadelphia is one example, of trying to do an urban homesteading with apartments. Very similar to that with the idea of sweat equity and taking some of the vacant apartments and, again, enabling the low-income people to kind of use sweat equity and work on rehabilitating the units. The units become theirs.
Isn't that what the Board of Trustees here in South Orange is trying to do now with this Mount Laurel thing? Did you see it in the paper today? In the news record, there are some houses, there are 123 units which have been put aside, and that money will be contributed by, and the residents have to contribute and work on it, and they have to live there 5 years or 7 years or whatever it is.
Did they mention
in order to... They're going to do it, they're starting off in the Ridgewood area near Newark, and there have been protests by some of the residents there who feel that this may be bad for the property values of that area, and there are others who are saying, no, it'll only improve the property and improve the value going towards Newark.
I'm not as familiar with the plans for South Orange. It would depend on how they would...
That would be working from Ridgewood Avenue down
Towards Newark.
so that would cover part of South Orange going down.
Well, South Orange extends down that way, so it's that part of South Orange.
So can I introduce you? As this
Tuxedo
is
Park.
Mrs. Ross, the village president's wife.
You said there aren't enough hands to do the work. There are plenty of hands around to do the work, but they're not allowed to do it, and I'll tell you why. Because the building unions are by and large closed corporations.
Why?
Because it all gets down to greed. They want to keep it for themselves. Okay? And until...
they're old timers too, like we are, and they do die out, and they would love to have young hands, but they want them to pay.
But they want them from their own families. They don't want to open it up to the outside.
Used to be that way.
Still that way. Plumbers
It always
union,
was that way
printing
with
union,
them.
same thing.
I think the worst problem would be the radiation. So homeless people in long abandoned buildings that they don't do anything about.
It probably, because of the numbers in terms of the kind of housing units that are in New York, the situation is certainly the most severe in terms of the number of people affected in New York. But you can go to places like Chicago. You can go to some places. I mean, you can go to East Orange. You can go to Orange. You could go to a Dover or a Morristown, and you could still find in varying degrees some trouble in trying to cope with this problem in terms of providing affordable housing. It's not whether or not there's housing that exists, because there is housing that exists, but whether or not you can afford to pay $1,000 a month for rent or more. You know, just think about that. That means that you have to have earnings of about $50,000 a year to rent that kind of a unit and be somewhat comfortable with it.
I'm talking about the abandoned houses in New York. Wouldn't it be better for New York City to fix those up and pay the kind of money they're paying the hotels for those people? It's ridiculous.
It would, however, they would probably counter the argument and say they do not have funds that are made available to them for that kind of work.
If they have the money to pay the hotel?
Because it basically comes from the federal government.
Nanny wanted to...
Do they have a rent control program in Milwaukee?
Do they have one? No.
They don't.
That to me is the crux of one of the main problems.
Can you stand up, Marshall?
One of the main, I feel that rent control in New York City, which I'm more familiar with, I don't know if you have it in Newark, I really feel that has done a lot to hasten the shortage of all the housing units in New York City. And so now it's a shrinking number of housing that's available for people who can rent, who can afford it.
You would find a number of people that would agree with you. I know I just...
And you can't get rid of it. They say the landlords are greedy. I mean, I don't think it's all one-sided like that.
No.
And I'm not a landlord. I have no stake in that. But I think they have a case. I think they do have a right to get some kind of profit for their investment. And also they have to renovate, and apartments are vandalized and have to be rehabilitated. And I think they deserve a fair return for their investment.
I think that people that would argue in this whole issue of controlling rent and not controlling rent is this point: what is a fair return? Now, most communities feel that somewhere between 6 and 10% is an adequate return. Maybe taking back a little bit of information from the study that we did in East Orange. Not only did we talk to tenants, we talked to landlords of the buildings that we interviewed tenants in. Most of our landlords felt that they were getting enough to cover for their expenses plus making profit. That may sound kind of surprising to me, but they did. Although they certainly would like to have received more, but when the bottom line came down, when we asked them, does the rent that you receive from your building actually cover all the operating expenses plus give you a profit? They said yes, it did. Okay, so, you know, and they have in East Orange it's 6%. At this point in time, it's 6%. Some of the communities are lower. For example, Maplewood is only like 3%, or it's based on the consumer price index type of thing.
Wasn't there a fact that rather than demolish the buildings in Newark that went down the high-rise, weren't there many, many people who offered to fix their own apartments and set the buildings straight and have homes there?
Well, I think that that kind of willingness is apparent in many communities, such as Newark and New York and Philadelphia. There's been examples. However, there would be some discussion in terms of, or some concern at the municipal level in terms of how to fund this kind of rehabilitation. And that, I think, there's funds available to do things like tear down the building, and there's not funds
They blow it away.
It's cheaper to tear down than
and that's also another point.
But that too, isn't it a fact that younger people, when we have vocational schools, the young people don't seem to go in for any kind of skill anymore. Try and find a plumber, try and get a carpenter. They're not interested in the work that they could get.
Well,
And
part-
therefore, we're so overcharged, as many of us feel, for the few that are around.
Well, well, part of it is that we've moved into a different type of economic structure, which is focusing on your ability to operate very complicated machinery. But you have to remember that construction, even though when you're working, you can be highly compensated in terms of your wages, it is extremely volatile in terms of the kind of work. You may be working for maybe 3 months of the year, and then you'll be off for the next 9 months. And so the instability of that kind of employment, I think, is a deterrent. Because
Our young generation
they don't have the patience.
How many have generation?
Well, I was just back on the issue of the high-rise. I think another issue there is that, unfortunately, the cities have determined that they probably made a mistake in building that style of architecture because it is not conducive to communal living. If you're a mother living on the 16th floor and your child is down on the ground playing, there is apprehension, and that whole sense of community is destroyed.
That's another problem. For example, I'm a Milwaukeean, Milwaukee never went into the high-rise construction for public housing. It was always low-rise, 2 and 3 stories in scattered sites. It was never these big blocks of apartment buildings like you'll see in New York, and you'll see the same ones that they were beginning to demolish in New York. Okay, so that's another. There was a structural problem with that kind of housing. That's true, and so there's an argument there that to live in that kind of condition could be problematic, but also I think the argument is much stronger at this point in time, saying, well, at least that housing could be rehabbed in some way. Now we're left with nothing at all, and what are we going to do with it? And most of the new housing units that are being constructed in this area are not for low-income families.
No.
They are not. And
You need so much more ground, too, for low.
well, it's certainly what they want to replace is with a smaller number of units as the garden-style apartment type, and it does take up more space. Now, Newark is an example where there is quite a bit of space that is available for that kind of construction because of the number of vacant buildings. But many communities do not. You couldn't do that kind of construction and adequately provide for the housing needs in a place like New York. So there are some problems with that kind of construction.
Why shouldn't their money be put aside to build these type of units which we're talking about? Take the people from the high rises that you want to demolish, put them in these small and the new places first, then demolish the high rise and build in that spot so that you don't throw out hundreds or thousands of people before you build anything that's low. Why should money be put to that purpose? Not only destroy first.
The bureaucracy moves very slowly, doesn't it?
It's common sense. It would be for the good of everyone.
But again, you have to remember that our mentality in terms of how housing should be provided is that really the government shouldn't be providing it at all.
Well, the government
It's
has
supposed
no
to be
mentality.
assumed.
And this is the case where the people should make the government accountable as far as mentality is concerned. I mean, that's no excuse.
Okay, but the only way that can be done is once we decide that housing is not a commodity to be bought and sold like it is. If housing was a basic right that everyone was entitled to, they are based on your ability to pay. That's the difference. You're entitled to have housing, but it's based on your ability to pay. And you would not see the problems, for example, or you do not see the problems that we see in the United States in some of the countries in Europe, because they have a different view of how housing should be provided and how much the government should be involved in the provision of housing. Okay. They have their problems too.
That's also with medicine too, isn't it? Socialized medicine? Sure. If they give housing.
There's more government sponsorship and involvement in terms of construction, and there's also less of a stigma in terms of being a resident in that kind of facility.
Less of a citizen.
Here you specifically, of course, law, and
So, but as long as we feel that where we live is contingent upon how much we can pay, I don't think we will see very much changes in terms of the housing.
I was going to ask about the next election. The Democrats versus the Republicans. Can you give us your this is your question.
To be a political scientist. And what specifically would you like in terms of housing? In terms of housing, and in terms of urban development, there has been for example, if you've been following so far what's been going on, it's only been within the last couple of weeks that any of the candidates have started to talk about homelessness and what they're going to do about it. Might do about it. Well, but I mean, but even still, many of them have been actively campaigning for a lot longer than a couple of weeks ago. It's only been because there's been more publicity and certainly in terms of more awareness and consciousness raising that's been going on in terms of the media, that it's becoming an issue that's slowly getting incorporated at some point in the candidate.
What you're saying is
policy.
it looks good.
Yeah.
Well,
Precisely.
I don't know. I'm not sure if it looks good. They're at least talking about it. If people were not as vocal, they might not even be discussing it at all. In terms of, I haven't really seen very much in terms of what they plan to do for cities and urban renewal and development. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I haven't heard very much. And unless again pressure is made on the candidates to really speak out and say, what do you intend to do for this problem or this problem in the city, I don't know if you'll hear very much. Those are the kind of issues that oftentimes are not considered the primary or predominant issues in an election. So housing and homelessness really, the number of people that might be affecting in terms of homeless people as being voters is very minute, and so it's not an issue that's going to draw votes, and so it's one that's not often discussed.
How do you explain the fact that the homeless population is increasing by leaps and bounds, and we're supposed to be in a great state of great economic wealth and prosperity, and during the Depression, you hardly saw any people who were lying in the street like that. They might have been a few drunks around, but that was about it. And now you walk over them practically.
They have no place to live.
Well, yeah, they still had to pay rent during the Depression. Lots of jobs.
Big increase in population.
I think more than anything else, you're talking about a difference in scale in terms of the size of the population.
We're also living through an area where certain ethnics are coming in and living 14 and 15 people in a room. We've been reading that in the papers right along now, more and more, where they're fire hazards, they're health hazards.
But they're not just the ethnics that are doing it.
But where are politicians who know of all this?
Depression families doubled up.
Yes.
I think that's what you were saying. You were saying, where did they go? Probably they went to live with other family members. It's not as likely to do that.
Now they won't do it.
They took care of one another. They were coming and they do living
Now,
in little apartments, many of them, and they immediately went out and got a job, worked 18 hours a day, and take any kind of a job.
Completely different values.
I think the lady forgets that during the Depression there were cardboard shanty towns that housed thousands of people around the fringes of cities.
you were saying that some people may not remember that in many communities there were shanty towns that sprung up of, basically a shanty town is temporary housing. I think, yeah. Well, in certain places around the world, that's one of the ways that housing is resolved in terms of problems.
Have you forgotten those aluminum huts? We had them too all around I think the school now has one down
Along
the
the
street that they
Mississippi.
turned into a kindergarten classroom.
The shanty towns are alongside the river. The towns on the high level, along King Lagoon, Upper King, everywhere.
Well, the population has grown by
In Mexico City, there's a shanty town which is bigger than the town itself.
Because in Mexico City, there's close to 40 million. In the metropolitan area, about 40 million.
40 million?
I'm not sure what the answer to all this is. It might be helpful to understand the problem if you would want to analyze why it is that we see this increased number of homeless people. It seems to me it has to do, one, obviously with an increase in the population of certain age grouping. It has to do with less jobs available because we have automated jobs that once were done by human beings. But beyond that, there seems to me to be a moral issue which has to do with a society that says that certain jobs really are beneath the dignity of people to do, and that in order to be a person, you have to have an education, you have to have a certain level of skill, and if I do not have that level of skill, I'm not sure that to be a person, I would be content to do something at a lower level. Now, I don't know how you see it as a sociologist, but it seems to me those are some of the issues at stake.
Well, I think that I think a lot of people around here are in agreement with your comments. We also have to, even for those that are working and those that do accept a job that most of us might say that we won't take because it's beneath us, they do not pay an adequate wage. Cleaning toilets at $3.35 an hour cannot pay for an apartment that's $500 a month. I mean, and even then, minimum wage, even if you work $5 an hour, that's only a little bit more than $10,000 a year, and you cannot pay for the rent that we see right now. So I think that part of the problem that we're seeing in terms of the increased number of those that are either homeless or that are doubling up because they can't afford to pay for a unit on their own. And there's a number of, for example, in East Orange, we had 30% of the tenants that we interviewed were living in overcrowded conditions. 30%. In overcrowded conditions. 30%. Okay. And so there is definitely an economic issue involved here. We are very reluctant to try to make some kind of commitment to ease that economic situation. Relatively few people, for example, in this country are getting any kind of rent subsidization. There's only out of about 90 million housing units, only about 2 million receive rent subsidies. Okay, so you're not getting that kind of support.
Here too, shouldn't we talk about the education system? So many dropouts. Today, in order to sell hosiery at Bloomingdale's, you have to have a college degree. They look for the people with the most education, and they're not producing that now. The educational system.
But every college professor will tell you he's earning a living, and every college will tell you that our tuition must go up and must go up and must go up, otherwise we can't have them.
But again, going back to the point, is that you don't have to be just working and earning minimum wage. You can be earning, think about this, I pointed out earlier, if you were earning a salary of $50,000 a year, you cannot afford to buy a house in Missouri. You cannot. You could, because you couldn't afford to have a mortgage that would be more than $100,000. How many houses do you know in here that are at that price? that means that $50,000, you shouldn't be, if you were earning $50,000 a year, you shouldn't be paying more than $1,100 or $1,200 a month in rent. There are many houses around here that, or apartments where the rents exceed that, and those that are lower tend to be smaller, and they may not fit the needs of the family that might be wanting those kind of, a unit with 2 or 3 bedrooms. You're talking about at least $1,000 for that. So we're not just talking about people if they're uneducated, or if they're working on minimum wage. That's one group, but we're talking about many working families, as well as single persons that are working that cannot afford housing because the costs have escalated.
With all this talk, where does it bring us?
Mary wants a solution.
What's the bottom line?
Dr. Santiago, you didn't know that
We would want.
we want a complete
Certainly, one thing I wish they would, in this area, as well as in other areas where they're not experienced, I would think that trying to work on an urban homesteading type of program might be one big way in which they could make some very viable solutions, with sweat equity and renovating homes as well as apartments. I wish they would certainly experiment on the apartment issue instead of selling them out for condo conversion. That might be one way of doing it. But the bottom line comes down to commitment in terms of supporting the construction of affordable housing. Now, the cost in the past, and many of you might have been participants in the past with the FHA and the VA home loan program, and right after the Second World War, most of the housing that was developed in the suburbs was subsidized by the government. That type of support has really dried up, virtually dried up.
You know why? So all of us here in this room, we got a federal deficit right now that we're not looking at it. But we sure know it's there. We realize that our children and our grandchildren are going to be paying.
Right.
Much more than we have to.
But on the other hand, if we fail to adequately house our citizens, and remember, housing isn't just the roof. I'm teaching a senior seminar on housing this semester. It's not just your roof. It involves the services that are available to you, access to jobs, schools, the kind of schools you have, everything. That's all part of where you live. Parking, all of those. You could think of many more to add to the list. That's all a part of what a house is. If we do not adequately address those needs, the budget deficit is not going to necessarily improve, and it's certainly going to create more problems in terms of quality of life for urban residents, of which most of us are.
I'd like to ask you about the homeless families. I know Reverend Thompson, can you give us a little bit what the churches are doing in this area? I know Catherine has been telling you.
Yeah, well, not to spend a lot of time on it, but there are, at this point, over 30 churches, synagogues, and other organizations in this part of Essex County, going as far out as Livingston in one direction, Irvington in the other direction, Glen Ridge in another direction, who are going to provide, in connection with Apostles House in Newark, temporary hospitality for homeless families, very small number.
Can only serve maybe, 4 or 5 families?
Well, we're talking about 14 people per night at this point, but they will be families, because the primary focus being on children, many of single-parent families. But anyway, Apostles House will be working with them during the day in terms of trying to find permanent housing. Many of them are working, but for those who are not, part of their task would be to try to secure jobs for them. Our job would be simply to host them for 2 meals and for overnight hospitality. But it's beginning in about 3 weeks, and will carry on, churches alternating a week at a time.
Since one-time donations that people are giving? Are you publicizing?
That's a part of it, yeah. Most of the religious communities and other organizations, it's kind of a low-key publication of it for a lot of reasons, but because we want to have some control over the residents who will be screened very carefully. In other words, drug addicts would not be able to participate in it, and the hardcore homeless, because again, the focus being for the needs for children and single-parent families largely.
I think one of the major problems is the rich do not want to know the poor, do not want to know the homeless, and do not want to be taxed or bribed.
Well, none of us want to be taxed. It's not just that the wealthy don't want to be taxed. Anything that would require some kind of intervention from any government level means that those who are not necessarily directly involved with it will be paying for it. So you may not be homeless, but your house.
What I'm driving at
But I
is
understand what
we
you're
live
saying.
in a society. In a society, everybody's got obligations. The obligation of the rich is to help the others. They don't want to see that, but it's true.
But
They get rich and then pay.
But did everyone hear what Amanda said? Wait till he gets rich and then he'll
That's
say
very unlikely.
Just see how it feels.
I'm rich in spirit.
We lived in South America, and we used to think how marvelous it was that Americans made such contributions, rich Americans, where families were dedicated to philanthropy. Granted, they weren't giving their fortunes away, but were doing so much more than when you live in South America and see enormous wealth, which isn't taxed, which has no responsibility, and it doesn't go to anybody. So I think in America, we're not right, and we're not the most generous, but on the other hand, we really are not that selfish, because there are people who do pay their way and who do try to make contributions.
Not enough.
The problems are enormous.
But again, I think that's the idea that this is a mentality in terms of that is pervasive throughout society. Working class people, middle class people, do not also want to contribute in any way, or really limit their. I'm not saying everyone, but overall, there's a vision that, again, remember, we have been ingrained from very little on, this is certainly sociology, that we are supposed to do with what we have and make the most of our talents and our efforts, and that somehow those who are less successful than us, it's their fault.
No.
Dr. Santiago, I want to thank you so much. We are very